Hello students, how are you all doing? I'm sure you all have had a wonderful time. So students, in our previous lectures, we talked about tenses. We're almost done with the tenses. And in my today's lecture, I'll be talking about active and passive voice. So let's see what is active and passive voice. So voice is the form a verb takes to indicate whether the subject of the verb performs or receives the action. So basically, there are two types of voices, active voice and passive voice. So as the definition suggests, that in active voice, the subject performs the action. On the other hand, in passive voice, as the word passive suggests, that the subject is passive and it does not perform the action, rather it receives the action. So there are basically two types of voices, active voice and passive voice. Now, what is active voice? Now, active voice indicates that the subject of the verb is acting. As I've just told you that in active voice, the subject performs the action rather than receiving the action. So most of the writers, they basically, they prefer active voice than passive voice because active voice is more efficient and effective. So it indicates that the subject of the verb is acting, like when I say, he is writing a letter. Okay, so in this sentence, he, which is a subject, is performing the action. So he's performing which action? He's performing the action of writing. Because the subject does or acts upon the verb in such sentence, the sentences are said to be in the active voice. So since the subject performs some action in this voice, so it is called active voice because the verb is not passive, it is active because it is performing a certain action. Now, these examples show that the subject is doing the verb's action. Now, see this sentence, the dog jumped onto the boy. In this sentence, the dog, which is the subject, is performing the action, is doing the action. And which action the subject is doing or performing? It's doing the action of jumping. So this action of jumping, this subject is performing or acting. That is why this sentence is known as the active voice. Christy will give a book report to the class. Now, in this subject, Christy, which is subject, is doing or performing the action. Which action? The action of giving. Likewise, the computer ate my paper. Now, in this sentence, the computer, which is the subject, is doing the action, which is eating. Okay, so in active voice, the subject is active and it performs or acts an action. Now, what is passive voice then? Well, as the word itself suggests, passive, which is opposite of active. So in active voice, the subject is active. That means subject is performing the action. It is doing the action. It is acting. On the other hand, in passive voice, the subject is passive. The subject is passive means that subject is not performing an action. It is not acting. Rather, it is receiving the action. It is passively receiving the action. So in a passive voice sentence, the subject and the object flip-flop. So subject will take the place of object and object will take the place of subject. So as a consequence, the subject becomes the passive recipient of the action. So in the passive voice, the subject does not perform an action. Rather, it becomes the passive recipient of the action. Because the subject is being acted upon. So it is not acting, it is being acted upon, or in passive, such sentences are said to be in the passive voice. So these sentences are said to be passive voice because in these sentences, the subject is not performing an action. The subject is not acting, rather it is receiving the action. So it is passive. Okay, let's talk about some of the examples of passive voice. These examples show the subject being acted upon by the verb. So in these examples, the subject is not going to perform any action, rather it is going to receive the action. It is being acted upon. Now see this sentence. The boy was jumped on by the dog. Now in this subject, in this sentence, boy, which is the subject, was being jumped on, which is the verb. Okay, so the boy was jumped on by the dog. Okay, so the boy is receiving the action. It is not, the boy is not performing the action. So who is performing the action? Actually, in this sentence, the dog is performing the action. The dog is jumping and the boy was jumped on by the dog. So the boy is receiving the action rather than acting or performing the action. Likewise, a book report will be given by Christy to the class. Now, book report here is in the place of subject. Okay, so we'll consider this as a subject here. So report will be given. So report is, which is subject in this sentence, which is not subject, but actually which has got the place of subject. So it is not acting, it is not performing any action, rather it is receiving the action. So who is performing the action? Actually, Christy is the real subject in this sentence, which is performing the action. And what action Christy is performing? Giving a book report. Likewise, my paper was eaten by the computer. So paper, which is subject here, was being eaten. So the action is being performed, being acted upon this subject. So in passive voice, students, the subject is not performing the action, it is receiving the action. And it is passive. It is passive recipient of the action. Reasons to use the active voice. Now, why we use active voice? As I've just told you that most of the writers, most of the renowned speakers, they prefer active voice rather than using passive voice. The reason is that active voice is more effective and efficient, and it is easy to communicate when you're using active voice, and it is easy for your listeners and for your readers to understand what you actually want to say. So most of the writers believe that you should not be using passive voice unless it is needed. So I'll be telling you the situation where you should be using passive voice, where it is important, it is essential to use passive voice. Otherwise, in different situations, normal situations, we should be using active voice. So when do we use active voice? Most writers prefer to use active voice because it is more direct, because it is more, as I've told you, that if you use active voice, it is easy to understand. For example, if I'm saying, or if I'm writing, I wrote a letter, okay, it's easy to understand because this is direct sentence, you know. So instead of writing, I wrote a letter, if I write, a letter was written by me, you know. So this is actually not the direct mode, and it will be a bit more difficult to understand this, this sentence. Well, when we can simply say I wrote a letter, it's not wise to use passive voice in this case. So compare these two sentences. Active: the waiter dropped the tray of food. See how easy it is to understand this sentence because it is more effective and efficient. So we easily come to know that the waiter dropped the tray of food. The waiter is the subject, and what did he do? He dropped the tray of food. If I say the same sentence like the tray of food was dropped by the waiter, okay, it's more indirect, and perhaps the listener or the reader will have to process this sentence in their minds to get the real meaning, actually, to know what the writer or the speaker actually wants to say. So in normal situations, you are advised to use active voice rather than passive voice. Of course, we do need passive voice, but I'll be telling you in what situations you should be using passive voice. So it's absurd if we can say that the peon rang the bell, and then we say the bell was rung by the peon. Okay, so it's more difficult to understand. Move on. Let's talk about some other reasons to use the active voice. The active voice is less awkward and clearly states the relationship between subject and action. I've just explained you this. Active voice is less awkward, so it is less awkward saying I wrote a letter rather than saying a letter was written by me. So it is less awkward, the active voice, and it clearly states relationship between subject and action. Now compare these two sentences. Let's start with the passive voice. Your request for funding has been denied by the review committee. Okay, now say the same thing in active voice. The review committee denied your request for funding. Now let's think for a while which sentence is easier to understand. I repeat both sentences. Your request for funding has been denied by the review committee, or the review committee denied your request for funding. I'm sure most of you would say that the second sentence is easier to understand because it is an active voice. The subject is performing the action, and it is less awkward, and it clearly states the relationship between subject and action. So the review committee denied your request for funding is easier to understand. The active voice sentence pattern propels the readers forward through your writing, thus avoiding weak prose. So this active voice sentence pattern propels the readers forward through your writing. So as a result, it avoids weak prose. Now, if active voice is more efficient and effective, then should we never use passive voice? Of course not. If passive voice is there, and there are certain situations where we have got to use passive voice, where passive voice is more effective or needed as compared to active voice. Now, when to use passive voice? In general, the passive voice is less direct, less forceful, and less concise than the active voice. We have already discussed this, that in general, so in general, you should be using active voice rather than passive voice, because in general, the passive voice is less direct and less forceful and less concise. But there are certain situations where we've got to use passive voice. So use the passive voice in the following situations. So when should you be using passive voice? You should be using passive voice in the following situations. Situation 1, use passive voice when you do not know or do not want to reveal the performer of an action. So we can use passive voice when subject is missing, when we don't know the subject, when we don't know who has performed the action. Okay, for example, when we say 3 people were robbed on the street. So we don't know who actually robbed them, or we don't want to reveal the performer of those actions. So in this case, of course, we've got to use passive voice. So 3 people were robbed on the street. Who robbed them? We don't know, or we don't want to reveal. So in this case, Of course, since there is no subject mentioned in the sentence, so we've got to use passive voice. There's no other alternative. There's no other option. So situation one, use passive voice when you do not know or do not want to reveal the performer, means subject of an action, when the subject is missing. Okay, when you're saying cars were sold, so who sold the cars, you don't know, or you don't want to reveal the identity of those people. Situation two, use passive voice when you want to emphasize the receiver of an action. Okay, so you can use passive voice when you want to emphasize the receiver. So for you, either action is more important or the receiver is more important as compared to the subject. For example, when you're saying roads are being constructed, so who is constructing them is not important, but this action of constructing the roads is important. Okay, or the object is more important. So we can use passive voice when we want to emphasize the receiver of an action. We can use passive voice when we do not know or do not want to reveal the performer of an action, doer of an action. Now see, there are two examples of passive voice. One is an awkward passive and the other one is deliberate passive. Now this is the example of an awkward passive. My bicycle was repainted by John. Now this is awkward. Why? Because you've got a subject and subject is important, and I don't know why should we be using a passive voice like this. My bicycle was repainted by John. So it's easy to say John repainted my bicycle. Okay, so when I say John repainted my bicycle, do you think it's easier to understand as compared to my bicycle was repainted by John? So since you have got the receiver of the action, the doer of the action, the subject, so there's no point why we should be using passive voice in this case. It's going to be an awkward passive. So a deliberate passive and effective passive is like, my bicycle was repainted. Now the performer is not mentioned and the emphasis is on the bicycle. Okay, so since the performer is not mentioned and the emphasis is not on the subject, but the emphasis is on bicycle. So bicycle is more important for us. So in this case, my bicycle was repainted is a better sentence for passive voice rather than my bicycle was repainted by John. Okay, so when you are having a deliberate passive voice, you're using passive voice deliberately. You'll be using it when the performer is not mentioned and the emphasis is on either the action or the receiver or the object. Let's talk about form of passive voice verbs. The passive voice requires a double verb and will always consist of a form of the verb to be and the past participle, usually the en, ed, and t form of another verb. So the passive voice requires two verbs, okay, main verb and auxiliary verb or to be verb. So to be verb is used and then past, when I say en and ed and t, that means we've got to use past participle, or in some other cases we can call this third form of the verb. So in passive voice we always use third form of the verb, which is known as past participle form, and we'll always use to be verb. So to be verb plus third form of the verb. Okay, so the third form of the verb or past participle verb is the constant. Now this to be verb will change actually according to the tense. Okay, for example, the tense is present simple. The to be verbs are would be is MR. So the toy is broken. Okay, the toys are broken. Okay, so here in this case, are is actually to be verb, and broken is actually the past participle form of the main verb. So in passive voice, we'll always be using past participle form of the verb, and we'll be using to be verb. Now this to be verb actually, we need to decide which to be verb is going to be used, because that depends on the tense that you're using. Different tenses will have different to be verbs. Okay, like if you have got present simple tense, to be verbs are is, am, are. If you're talking about present progressive tense, to be verbs are is being, are being, am being. If you are using past simple tense, to be verbs are was and were. So the toy is broken, the toys are broken, the toys were broken, past simple. The toys are being broken, present progressive. The toys have been broken, present perfect. The toys were being broken, past progressive. The toys had been broken, past perfect. So this to be verb is going to be changed according to the tense of the sentence. Let's see some examples. John baked the bread. The passive voice would be first, the bread, which is object here, will come in place of another rule is that in passive voice, your subject will replace your object and your object will replace your subject. Okay, so the bread, and then since this is past simple tense, so the helping verbs which are used with past simple tense and passive voice are was and were. Since this is the bread is single one thing, so we'll be using was as helping verb. So to be verb is was, and then baked is already past participle form. So the bread was baked. And then since we have mentioned the subject John here, so before writing John, we'll use by John. Okay, so the bread was baked by John. Now was is a form of the verb to be. So I hope you understand that all rules will remain same. That your first rule is that when you are going to change active voice into passive voice, your object will take the place of subject and subject will take the place of object. And after writing your object, you'll be using to be verb, and this to be verb is actually according to the tense. Since this is past simple tense, so in past simple tense the to be verb is was. So the only thing that you need to remember is to know which to be verb is used in which tense. Okay, I've already explained you that which to be verbs are used with what tense. For example, with present simple tense we use is, am, are. With past simple tense we use was and were. With present progressive tense we'll be using is being, am being, are being. With past progressive we'll be using was being, were being. Likewise with present perfect we'll be using has and have been, have been. And past perfect will be using had been. So this to be verb is the only thing that you need to change in your passive voice. So first rule is that subject will take place of object and object will take place of subject. Second rule is you'll be using to be verb according to the tense. Third rule is that you'll be using past participle form of the verb. So since here the verb is already in past participle, so we have used past participle form. And if you are using the subject, which will go in place of object here, before using subject, we'll be using preposition by. Okay, so John baked the bread. The bread was baked by John. John is baking the bread. The bread is being baked by John. John bakes the bread. The bread is baked by John. John has baked the bread. The bread has been baked by John. John had baked the bread. The bread had been baked by John. Okay, see, everything will remain same. All the rules will remain same. The only thing that you need to understand is which to be verb is used with what tense. So form of passive voice verb. Writers should be familiar with the form of to be, often called linking verbs, so that they can easily identify the passive voice in their work. This is exactly what I've been telling you, that the only thing you need to understand is that what to be form of the what to be verb is used with what tense, because that's the only thing which will be changed according to tense. Otherwise, everything else will remain same when you are turning an active voice into passive voice. So review the forms of to be. These are the different forms. Am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been. I've already told you them. So note the form of to be in the examples of the verb to kick in various forms of the passive voice. I've already given example. Let's talk about one more example. For example, the main verb is to kick. Now, how you can use this verb in different passive voice sentences and tenses. So to kick is kicked. Now, in what sentence you'll be using is kicked? And of course, in present simple tense. Okay, the boy kicks the ball. The ball is kicked. Okay, the ball was kicked. Okay, so was kicked is actually in past simple. Is being kicked. Present progressive. Has been kicked. Present perfect. Was being kicked. Past progressive. Had been kicked. Past perfect. Is going to be kicked and will be kicked. And future simple. Can be kicked. So if you've got a modal verb like can and should, you can make their passive voice as well. The boy can kick the ball. The ball can be kicked. The boy should kick the ball. The ball should be kicked. So if you are using a modal verb, so you can make passive voice with these modal verbs as well. So what you'll be doing after the modal verb, you'll be using be, and you'll be using the third form of the verb, past participle form of the verb. Now, often passive voice sentences will contain by phrase indicating who or what performed the action. Okay, so if you are mentioning the doer of the action and your passive voice, so before the doer of the work, means before the subject, you'll be using by. Okay, for example, the boy kicks the ball. The ball is kicked by the boy. Okay, so the boy, which is the doer of the action, before doer of the action, will be using by in passive voice. So passive voice sentences can be easily transformed into active sentences when the object of the preposition by is moved to the subject position in the sentence. So, for example, if the passive voice sentence is the ball is kicked by the boy. So if you want to convert this into active voice, now this by the boy, okay, you'll remove by and you'll place the boy, which is coming at the end in this passive voice sentence. You'll put it in the beginning in the active voice, because this object will become subject in your active voice. See this example. The cookies were eaten by the children. Now, you have used by before the subject, before the doer of the action in passive voice. So if you want to convert this into active, the first rule is that you will remove this by and you will put this doer of the action in the beginning. So the children in active voice, the children, which was the object of the passive voice, becomes subject of active voice, the children again, and then were eaten. So we will remove this to be verb in active voice, we don't need. So since were eaten clearly indicates that the sentence is in past simple, so when we use active voice, we'll be using second form of the verb, because in past simple we use second form of the verb. So the children ate. The children ate what? So the cookies. Okay, so the cookies, which is the subject in passive voice, will replace the object of active voice. So see, if you want to change this passive voice into active voice, it's very simple. Put this object in place of subject and subject in place of object, and then just see, remove by, and then see what tense is used actually. This to be verb will let you know what tense is used. So when we see it is were eaten, so we come to know that this is a past simple tense. So in active voice and past simple tense, we use second form of the verb. So it's easy to convert this passive voice into active voice. Let's have one more example. The tunnels are dug by the gophers. Okay, the tunnels are dug by the gophers. If you want to put it into active voice, now this, the gophers, which is object, will come first, the gophers, and the tunnels, which is subject, will come in place of the object. So the gophers, the tunnels. Okay, in between you only need the verb. Now which verb? Actually, if you see the sentence are dug, so in this sentence, which to be verb is used? Are, only are. That means the tense is actually in present simple tense. Okay, so in present simple tense, this is the gophers will simply have first form of the verb. The gophers dug the tunnels. The tunnels are dug by the gophers, and then are dug the tunnels. Let's have more practice. Let's see if you are able to do this. Now let's practice some of the sentences. Direction, change the sentences below to the active voice. So the following sentences are in passive voice, and you have to turn them into active voice. I'll read the sentence and then I'll stop for say 5-10 seconds to give you a chance to put that sentence into active voice, and then I'll tell you the active voice. So the first sentence is, the statue is being visited by hundreds of tourists every year. So what do you think is going to be the active voice? Okay, let's do first sentence together. Now, the statue is being visited by hundreds of tourists every year. So in active voice, the first thing we need to do is to identify the subject. What is subject in this sentence? The statue is being visited by hundreds of tourists. So hundreds, who is visiting? Hundreds of tourists are visiting. Okay, so hundreds of tourists is subject. They are visiting what? They are visiting the statue. The statue is object. So the subject is the hundreds of tourists. What they do? Hundreds of tourists are visiting. Is being visited. That means this is in present progressive tense. Hundreds of tourists are visiting the statue every year. Let's move to the second sentence. My books were stolen by someone yesterday. What do you think? So the correct sentence would be someone, which is subject. Someone was stolen, stole, past simple. Someone stole what? Someone stole what? Someone stole my books. When? Yesterday. Someone stole my books yesterday. 3. These books had been left in the classroom by a careless student. So what do you think? What could be the active voice? Okay, so what is the subject here? A careless student had been left. That means this is past perfect. So a careless student had left. Had left what? A careless student had left these books where? In the classroom. So a careless student had left these books in the classroom. Fourth sentence, coffee is raised in many parts of Hawaii by plantation workers. So the active voice would be plantation workers raise coffee in many parts of Hawaii. Fifth sentence, the house been broken into by someone while the owners were on vacation. So the active voice would be someone had broken the house while the owners were on vacation. So this is how you change the passive voice sentences into active voice sentence. Now, what if the sentences are in active voice and you are asked to change them or convert them into passive voice? Let's have some practice for this as well. So the sentence is, children cannot open these bottles easily. So how can you change this into passive voice? So what is the receiver of the action in this sentence? What is the object? These bottles. So these bottles cannot be opened by whom? By children easily. Children cannot open these bottles easily. These bottles cannot be opened by children easily. Second sentence, the government built a road right outside her front door. So what is the object? Of course, a road. A road was built by the government right outside her front door. Let's see third sentence. Mr. Rose broke the antique vase as he walked through the store. So what is the object here? The antique vase was broken by Mr. Rose as he walked through the store. Let's move to the next sentence. When she arrived, the changes amazed her. So the passive voice would be, she was amazed by the changes when she arrived. The last sentence is, The construction workers are making street repairs all month long. What do you think? What could be the passive voice? So the streets are being repaired by the construction workers all month long. So this is how you can change the passive voice into active voice. So students, in my today's lecture, I've told you about active voice and passive voice. I have explained you what active voice and passive voice are. I've also told you in what situations should we use active voice and passive voice. And I've also told you different rules to convert an active voice into passive voice and a passive voice into active voice. And we have had some practice for this as well. I'm sure by now you have understood what active and passive voice are. And if you are given any question related to active and passive voice, you can attempt that. Please do some practice for the sentences and write some sentences in active voice and try to convert them into passive voice, and then write some sentence in passive voice and try to convert them into active voice. And when you're speaking to somebody, when you're writing anything, please keep in mind that generally we use active voice in general situations because active voice is more effective and efficient. Do use passive voice only when it is required. In what conditions? I've already explained you that in what situation you should be using passive voice. So you should be using passive voice when the subject is not known or you don't want to reveal the identity of the doer of the work, or the action or the object is more important than the subject, the doer of the work. Wish you best of luck. See you till the next video. Goodbye.